I will respect your truth, you respect my truth. And that way we can coexist together in our country, despite all the various differences amongst us. My dear Professor Radhakrishna, I am at a loss for words. This has been one of the most elaborate book releases I've ever had the pleasure of participating in. Illuminated by such a galaxy of eminences, Justice Santosh Hegde, Dr. Chandrasekhar Kambar, seeing, of course, for the first time, Dr. Nagarajaya and Kamala Hampana, the eminent Sri Sundara Shivarao, and for me, and of course, Minister H.K. Patil, who went and said he will come back, but I told him, don't have to worry about coming back, we won't be that long. But I'm just totally overwhelmed and honored by the kindness you have done me, not only in translating my book into Kannada, but in sharing it with such a distinguished audience and in front of so many truly eminent people. I suffer from the handicap of not knowing any Kannada, but I could catch a little bit of some sense of what was being said, and I thank all of you for your kind words about my book and about myself. The question that I was asked to answer was why I wrote this book, which I thought was a fair question. I wrote the book without really intending to write a book about Hinduism. I had, in my book of 26 years ago, India from Midnight to the Millennium, I had in a couple of pages addressed the question of my Hinduism in the context of the aftermath of the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the rise of a certain particular kind of movement in the mid-90s. I didn't think it needed more than a couple of pages, so that's all I did. But then, as you know, there was a major change in the climate of this country. And the people who had come to power from 2014 did so in the name of a political ideology that they anchored in my faith, what they called Hindutva. And for myself as a Hindu who could not recognize my Hinduism in what they were doing, I thought it became morally imperative to try and explain, perhaps in the hope of achieving some recognition from others who thought of Hinduism as I did, that there was a different understanding and a different interpretation of the faith that was possible. Now, as our good friend Professor Radhakrishna has pointed out, I did say at the very beginning of the book, why I'm a Hindu is because I was born one. But then I go on for 400 pages to develop on that theme, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you want to hear. I'll try and give a fairly brief response. What did being a Hindu mean to me? Born in London, growing up in Bombay, in Calcutta College in Delhi, the son of Keralite parents who were themselves displaced, as it were, migrants in other cities, but who were nonetheless were deeply rooted in their Hinduism and brought up their children to be anchored in the faith, and at the same time took us on pilgrimages to the various temples around the country and so on. And yet led us to find our own, to come to terms ourselves with our faith. My Hinduism was a lived faith. It was a Hinduism of experience and upbringing, a Hinduism of observation and conversation, not one anchored in deep religious study, though of course the two are not mutually exclusive. Certainly growing up, I knew very few mantras, just a few snatches of a couple of hymns, and practically no Sanskrit. My knowledge of Hindu sacred texts and philosophies came entirely from reading them in English translation. And why not? When I went to a temple, I prayed in an odd combination of English, Sanskrit, and my mother tongue, Malayalam, instinctively convinced that an omniscient God must naturally be multilingual. Now, the first challenge, of course, in describing Hinduism is definitional. The very name Hindu itself connotes something less and more than a set of theological beliefs. In many languages, French and Persian amongst them, the word for Indian is Hindu. Originally, Hindu simply meant the people beyond the river Sindhu or Indus. And the Persians couldn't pronounce the S, and so it became Hindu. But anyway, the Indus is now in Islamic Pakistan, and to make matters worse, the word Hindu did not exist in any Indian language till its use by foreigners gave Indians a term for self-definition. So it's very ironic when I hear some people in the ruling party objecting to the use of the word India, saying that it is not authentic, and the same people shout slogans saying, "Garv se kaho ki hum Hindu hai." Well, India and Hindu derive from the same etymology. If you don't want to use Indian, you can't use Hindu either. They both come from the same source, so the same way from the river Sindhu, and with a Persian mispronunciation. So it's still interesting, though, that Hindus call themselves by a label that they didn't invent themselves in any of their own languages, but adopted cheerfully when others began to refer to them by that word. I know some Hindus prefer a different term altogether, Sanatana Dharma, but that, of course, or eternal faith, but that, of course, has come into another kind of controversy with the Dravidian movement, so we can discuss that separately. Hinduism is thus the name that foreigners first applied to what they saw as the indigenous religion of India. It embraces an eclectic range of doctrines and practices, pantheism, agnosticism, faith in reincarnation, to belief in the caste system. But none of these, and this is where I part company from Hindutva, none of these constitutes an obligatory credo for a Hindu. There are none. We have no compulsory dogmas. And this is why I'm so comfortable with the tenets of Hinduism, much more than I would be with those of the other faiths of which I know. I've long thought of myself as a liberal, not just in terms of sort of, political sense of the term liberal, or even in relation to the principles of economics, but as an attitude to life. To accept people as one finds them, to allow them to be and become what they choose, and to encourage them to do whatever they like, so long as it does not harm others, is my natural instinct. It is also what Hinduism teaches. As the great preacher Swami Vivekananda put it, when he addressed the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, he said, "I'm proud to speak to you of a faith that has taught the world not just tolerance, but acceptance." Now, I read that as a teenager, and the idea stayed with me for a very long time, and I kept reflecting on it. Because I too went to school like many of you and learned that tolerance is a virtue, that a tolerant king is a good king because he indulges others and so on. But when you really think about it, tolerance is a very, very patronizing idea. It says, I have the truth, you are in error, but I will magnanimously indulge you in your right to be wrong. That's all that tolerance is saying. Whereas acceptance, which is what Vivekananda says Hinduism teaches us, acceptance says, I will respect your truth, you respect my truth. And that way we can coexist together in our country, despite all the various differences amongst us. In fact, Vivekananda said in Chicago, we believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true. And the idea is that the Hindu, grounded in acceptance, sees truth in all beliefs. He accepts the other's truth, demanding only that the other accept his truth. Vivekananda often quoted an ancient hymn, the Shiva Mahimna Stotram, which declares that just as multiple rivers originating in different places flow down different hills and valleys, some straight, some crooked, but all end up in the same sea, so also all forms of worship reach the same divine. And this is why when the great sages first came up with the original idea of the divine, of Brahman, it was very much similar to the Islamic idea of God, the Nirguna Brahman. That is, a God without shape, without form, without gender, without something you could not imagine, could not depict. That was the original concept. But the rishis realized that this was not good enough for ordinary people. They found in the Vedic era that people were worshipping mountains and trees and rivers because they needed something to focus their worship on. And thus was born the idea of the Saguna Brahman, the God with qualities, the divine with qualities. But because, of course, no one could ascribe any very specific qualities to the divine, every believer was free to imagine the divine in whatever form or shape he or she chose to. So you wanted to imagine God as a 10-armed woman riding a tiger? You're welcome to do that. Your goddess is Durga. You want to imagine God as a pot-bellied figure with an elephant's head? You're welcome to do that. You can have Ganesh as your Ishtadevta, as Professor Radhakrishnan said. And by the same logic, if you want to imagine God as a bleeding man suffering on a cross, Hinduism has no problem with that either. And that is something that people of other faiths sometimes find difficult to understand. So raised as I was as a Hindu, rigid and censorious beliefs have never appealed to my temperament. In matters of religion too, I found that my liberal instincts were reinforced by the faith in which I was brought up. Hinduism is in many ways predicated on the idea that the eternal wisdom of the ages and of divinity cannot be confined to a single sacred book. We have many sacred books, and we can delve into each to find our own truth or truths. As a Hindu, therefore, I can claim adherence to a religion without an established church or a priestly papacy, a religion whose rituals and customs I'm free to reject, as I do reject personally the caste system, a religion that does not oblige me to demonstrate my faith by any visible sign, by subsuming my identity in any collectivity, not even by a specific day or time or frequency of worship. There is no Hindu Pope. There is no Hindu Vatican. There is no Hindu catechism. There is not even a Hindu Sunday. You can worship your Ishtadevta on different days of the week depending on what day is ascribed to him or her. So as a Hindu, I follow a faith that offers a veritable smorgasbord of options, a palette of options to the worshipper of divinities to adore and to pray to, of rituals to observe or not, of customs and practices to honor or not, of fasts to keep or not. That's entirely up to you. As a Hindu, I can subscribe to a creed that is free of the restrictive dogmas of Holy Writ, one that refuses to be shackled to the limitations of a single volume of holy revelation. Hinduism professes no false certitudes. Its capacity to express wonder at creation and simultaneously skepticism about the omniscience of the Creator are unique to Hinduism. We heard a beautiful rendering earlier of the Nirvana Shaktam, but here I'm going to quote briefly in a verse from the 500-year-old Rig Veda, the Nasadiya Sukta, or the creation hymn, which memorably ends with these lines about creation, how the whole world came into being. And I'm quoting now, "Who really knows and who can say? Whence did it all come? And how did creation happen? The gods themselves are later than creation. So who knows truly whence this great creation sprung? Who knows whence this creation had its origin? He, whether he fashioned it or whether he did not, he who surveys it all from the highest heaven, he knows, or maybe even he does not know." Now, this is written 3,500 years ago, Rig Veda 1291. And when you think maybe even he does not know, I love a faith that raises such a fundamental question about no less a supreme being than the creator of the universe. Maybe he does not know indeed. Who are we mere mortals to claim a knowledge of which even he cannot be certain? Hindu thought also makes a virtue out of the unknowability of God. There is a marvelous story in one of the Upanishads about a sage who is asked to define the nature of God. The wise man, normally very loquacious, falls silent. He is pressed by his disciples for an answer, and he replies that his silence was his answer, for the absolute is silence. The mystery of the divine reality cannot be reduced to words or speech. Neither thought nor words can suffice. It is not understood by those who understand it, says the Kena Upanishad. It is understood by those who do not understand it. The final words of the Upanishads are neti neti, not this, signifying the unspeakability of the absolute. For many sages, their consciousness of the divine is untranslatable to others. For those who have not attained the same realization cannot grasp it through words or signs. It is that of which nothing can be said. Now, above all, as a Hindu, I belong to the only major religion in the world that does not claim to be the only true religion. I find it immensely congenial to be able to face my fellow human beings of other faiths without being burdened by the conviction that I'm embarked upon a true path that they have somehow missed. Hinduism asserts that all ways of belief are equally valid, and Hindus readily venerate the saints and the sacred objects of other faiths. There are so many examples of Hindus regularly going to Sufi dargahs, where there are shrines set up to Muslim heroes. We talked about Varavara Swami earlier this evening. Sikh Gurudwaras, of course, many of us have gone and worshipped in them. The truth is that, and certainly my late wife would regularly light candles in churches because she believed, as many Hindus instinctively do, that the power of the divine is not confined to one place of worship. Any place that is sanctified by human worship is worth respecting. Now, this to my mind is incredibly special and important, and I'm proud that I can honor the sanctity of other faiths without feeling that I'm betraying my own. If I go to a church or I go to a Gurudwara or I go to a Sufi dargah, I don't feel I'm betraying Hinduism, because Hinduism teaches me that all these are equally valid ways of reaching out to God. In the 21st century, to turn to slightly more modern language, Hinduism has many of the attributes of a universal religion, a religion that is personal and individualistic, that tells you to seek the truth within yourself, that privileges the individual and does not subordinate him or her to a collectivity. A religion that grants and respects complete freedom to the believer to find his or her own answers to the true meaning of life. A religion that offers a wide range of choice in religious practice, even in regard to the nature and form of the formless God. A religion that places great emphasis on one's mind and values one's capacity for reflection, intellectual inquiry, and self-study. A religion that distances itself from dogma and holy writ, that is minimally prescriptive and yet offers an abundance of options, spiritual and philosophical texts, and social and cultural practices to choose from. In a world where resistance to authority is growing, Hinduism imposes no authorities. In a world of networked individuals, Hinduism proposes no institutional hierarchies. In a world of open source information sharing, Hinduism accepts all paths as equally valid. In a world of rapid transformation and accelerating change, Hinduism is adaptable and flexible, which is why it has survived for millennia. Now, there is one controversial section in this book that Professor Radhakrishnan chose not to refer to much, and that is my analysis of Hindutva and my analysis of why it departs in very fundamental ways from what I understand Hinduism to be. I know that many of that persuasion who agree with the rest of the book get very exercised about that section, but I hope it's there in full in the book.
It's very much there.
Very much there, says Professor Radhakrishnan. Because I think it's important to understand, when I talk about taking Hinduism back, it is to take it back from those who have distorted its meaning by attempting to, in the name of that faith, to reduce the soaring majesty of our philosophical inquiry, of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Gita and the teachings of all our great sages and gurus, and bring them down to the level of the British football hooligan. The British football hooligan who goes around with his placard saying, if you don't support my team, I'm going to hit you on the head with it. That is not Hinduism, but sadly, that is what certain political elements have reduced Hinduism to. So that is broadly why I wrote the book. I hope that I've communicated something of its essence to all of you, and I congratulate again Professor Radhakrishnan for having taken the trouble and so successfully to have translated this book and introduced it to a discerning audience in Karnataka. Thank you very much. Namaskaram. Jai.